my point is that this process has been going on for decades, that the Department of Finance and the Department of Housing and Community Development developed these housing goals for the cities. But it seems that SB 828 inadvertently has introduced these errors because of a misunderstanding that the existing housing needs were not already being factored in, and a misunderstanding about vacancy rates. Can we go to the next page, please, Rick? This just shows you the scale of the issue. So you can see on the left-hand side, these are the 4 major urban regions in California. These 4 areas, Greater Sacramento, San Diego, the Greater Bay Area, and the 6 SoCal counties make up 80% of the housing in California. And each of these bars represent one of those regions. As you can see, the green is the most predominant, and that is the LA counties, the 6 counties of Southern California. If you look at the third bar, which is 2013 to 2022, that is the 5th RHNA cycle. So that's the cycle that just happened before. And that's the one I was explaining happened at the time of the Great Recession. And you can see that the amount of housing during that cycle went down for that cycle. And the reason is because of the Great Recession and the increased vacancy rates. But as you can also see, this step up is extreme for the most recent 6th cycle. And I'll also point out that these housing assessments were made before COVID, and so I think they also need to be assessed in terms of what impact COVID will have on these numbers. Rick, if we can go to the next page.
Gab, before you go to the next page, could you go back one? I want to point something out to people who might not understand the colors.
The one before.
Yeah, can you
Rick?
go back one? Who's in charge? Yeah,
Rick's
I just want to say a couple things here. Everybody take a close look at those bars. Those are what the regions were required to do during those time periods. And so if you look at the new period we're facing starting next year, they're talking about doubling anything we've ever done before. And it's simply, not only is it impossible, but as Gab will get into later, California has flat growth. California is not growing. LA is flat, San Francisco is flat, and this is before COVID. So when you see the bars, you realize, what state are they estimating here? Which state has got that many more people and that much crowding and doubling up of people living in homes together? Is that really true? And so that's the fundamental finding that Gab got to, is that this massive number that they're forcing on the cities is completely fake. It's completely false. It's just dead wrong because of SB 828. And Gab is much kinder than I am. She thinks it was inadvertent, but the bill was written by Scott Wiener. So I have my doubts that it was unintended.
We can put it on the table now.
Gab thinks it might be. So go ahead, Gab, sorry, to the next slide.
So this is how we sort of tried to explain the difference between how the HCD used to do it in the past and how they're doing it now, and where these errors were introduced. Now, there was some misunderstanding that this, what we've labeled at the bottom as conventional economist approach, people thought that was somehow a model that the Embarcadero Institute had built, but it's not. It's all it is on the left-hand side of the column is the current 6th cycle HCD model, and the bar beside it is showing what that number would look like if they were using the same formulas they've been using for the last 20 or 30 years. And the formula that they use is not just something that they've come up with on their own. It's also, if you look at any major economic approach to estimating housing needs, you will find that it's a very standardized approach. They, to look at, to have a benchmark vacancy rate, to have a replacement rate for units, and then to adjust your house rate of household formation to an optimal level. All of that is normal, standard approach to estimating housing needs. What happened in this most recent sixth cycle is that in addition to that, the HCD has added in cost burdening and overcrowding as separate factors, even though the Department of Finance had already factored those into the projected household number that they gave to the Department of Housing and Community Development. So that, in a sense, is where there's a double counting. And also the vacancy rate, as I said, was overestimated, because where they should have been using a and as they have always, they have in the past, used a 1.5% benchmark vacancy rate for owner-occupied housing. This time they use 5% across the board. And they also, one of the reasons why their overcrowding number is so large is that they basically said for every one overcrowded house, we need another house. They applied that thinking in the same way they would apply vacancy rate. But the way the American Community Survey measures overcrowding is they say the optimal number of people per room is 1. And they count, they're not just talking bedrooms, they're talking other rooms in the house, but they say we would like to see no more than 1 person per room as our measure. And then they look at how many houses have more than 1 person per room. So that means that, some houses could have 1.2 or 1.6. But basically, this approach, if you just say for every 1 house, we need for every overcrowded house, we need another house, that assumes that the overcrowding in these houses is 2, which is extremely high. It's a little hard to explain, but generally speaking, most of those overcrowded homes fall in the 1 to 1.5 category. So they skew lower. So even the estimate as it is it's a double count on a double count in a way. It's not mathematically, it doesn't make sense. Anyway, looking at this, the area that has been most impacted was the 6 Southern California counties. And in fact, some of the regions, I think that in Sacramento, in San Diego, they didn't even apply the cost burdening factor to San Diego. So there's another issue, which is there's an inconsistent approach to all the different regions. And you see that in the way that Southern California, the 6 Southern California counties have been particularly impacted. And their numbers, particularly in certain cities, have tripled. Rick, if we could go to the next slide, thanks. No, okay, this is a very, very dense slide. And I've really summed that up before. My first point is that they mistakenly assumed that the Department of Housing and Community Development had not previously taken into account existing housing need, which has been documented on multiple sites of the HCD and the Department of Finance. So that assumption was incorrect. The second bucket is the idea of this using 5% as a healthy vacancy rate for owner-occupied housing. You can see in that diagram on the right, that's showing you the annual homeowner vacancy rates for the United States since about the late 60s. It's probably hard to see, but all I can tell you, the line at the top of the graph says 5%. If you can see that line, that's the assumption the state made. In reality, those numbers have really hovered around 1.5%. You can see even at the height of the Great Recession, they just hit 3% briefly for a year or two and then recovered. But this idea that 5% is a healthy vacancy rate in owner-occupied housing is false. It would be a disaster if we had that level of vacancies in the housing market. If we can go on to the next slide, Rick. Oh, this just says like where the errors, how big the errors were and where they came from. So for the 4 regions, these mistakes led to a total of an overcounting of 941,000 units. The incorrect use of the vacancy rate is approximately 230,000 of those, that 940,000. And then the overcrowding and cost burdening is more than 700,000 of that number. One of the other things I found in the with these RHNA calculations that is interesting is that when everyone is given their apportion their housing needs and told what their target should be, they come down to numbers that 229,532 housing units. And it gives you the sense that there's this incredible accuracy associated with these numbers. But most of them are based on information from the American Community Survey. And all those measurements, because it's a survey, have a margin of error that is reasonably significant. So I personally think that those numbers should never be at that level of accuracy, because it gives people a false sense of precision. They should be rounded based on the margin of errors to the nearest 1,000. Rick, if we could go to the next one. I think, yeah, actually the one that I just showed before, I had a quote from some of the discussions that had taken place with ABAG and the HCD that clearly show that overcounting is a mistake, because it says how they have already factored in overcrowding and cost burdening into the projected number of households. But anyway, here in this slide, this is very telling as well, because this tells you what we're actually building. On the left-hand side is the permit progress for the same 4 regions in the 5th cycle. Now, the HCD has only published up until 2019. The permits have been issued in 2019. So that for a lot of these regions, we're only halfway through. But even last year, we have been tracking at the same rate. So we've actually looked at the prorated numbers, where we should be against our targets and where we are. And you can see on the left-hand graph that we are knocking the ball out of the park on market rate housing. There's no question that no one's holding back cities on market rate housing. They're knocking the ball out of the park. What they are failing to build is the very low and low income housing. They're building, actually, if you look at this number, it's 20%, less than 20% of the actual target, but it's consistent with how the tools that cities have at their disposal to build affordable housing. Because as we said, since the money has dried up from the states, and the states is no longer helping us with funding for building affordable housing, most cities have to rely on the inclusionary zoning to build affordable housing. Most of that is set at something like 15 to 20%. If you build, if you include 15 to 20% of the units of affordable housing, you get a density bonus that allows you to build more market rate housing. So it's really no surprise that that's the ratio that we're building, because that's what we've enshrined in the laws that currently exist. The unfortunate thing is there's some laws, like the most recent one, AB 2345, that wants to reduce the amount of affordable housing required to achieve the density bonus, so that it's going to send that ratio in the wrong direction. What we need is to elevate the number on the left, the amount of affordable housing that we're building, and remove this sort of slavish focus on the market rate. The market is going to take care of itself. I actually think RHNA should not be in the business of setting market rate targets. The state doesn't control the market. The market operates completely independently. And they should really be thinking about how do we stimulate the affordable housing supply. And really, they've essentially abrogated responsibility for this. And have left it to cities with no money to achieve these targets, and then turn around and blame cities for not building it. It seems like a very unfortunate situation. And you can see that this hasn't just happened in the fifth cycle. The chart on the right shows you how ABAG, so this is only one because not all of these regions have kept very good records for the last 3 decades, but ABAG has. And you can see that they have consistently built more than their market rate number and consistently underperformed on affordable housing. So this is nothing new. In the middle, the fourth cycle, you can see it was affected by the Great Recession. So in that case, it only met its market rate targets, and the affordable housing was even worse off because of the Great Recession. But
yeah, could you explain the little dotted square? The typeface is too small for some of us to read. Could you describe what that little dotted square means?
Yeah, that's I was trying to say just then, but it's essentially, you can't see the line. It's basically on zero. It's basically saying that in that cycle we built just to the level of of what we were supposed to. So we didn't overachieve on market rate. We built exactly the amount of market rate we were required, but we did worse on our affordable housing. That particular fourth cycle was very much impacted by the Great Recession. So you would expect both targets to be lower as they are. In fact, if you took out the impact of the Great Recession, what you see is a general trend. We're getting worse on building our affordable housing. And that also makes sense because since the shuttering of the redevelopment agencies, there's a lot less money to be put into affordable housing. So I think we're either going to continuing this is where we're going to be at, building 20% of our target for affordable housing, or potentially it's going to get worse if more of these bills that incentivize market rate of affordable housing are allowed to go through. Perhaps we can go to the next slide. Okay, this is actually just shows you the extent of, the reason why we're failing to build affordable is because the funding for affordable housing fell off a cliff when the RDAs closed. As Jill said, they weren't perfect vehicles. There was a lot of corruption, or there was some corruption in those RDAs, and they only had to spend 20% of the funding on affordable housing. So, of the funds that were redirected, only 20% of them had to be spent on affordable housing, but it definitely made a difference. We were producing a lot more affordable housing before the RDAs closed than we are now. And then on the right-hand side, this clearly shows you how we're building. So, we're supposed to be building 60% of our, roughly, we're supposed to be building 60% of affordable housing, and I'm including moderate, low income, very low income, and extremely low income. If we think about it just as the extremely low, very low, and low, where it's almost 1-for-1 with market rate housing. So for every one market rate house, we should be building at least one in the very low category. That's what the RHNA targets tell us we're supposed to be building. What's actually happening is in the green bars, and you'll see this has been consistent, third, fourth, and fifth cycle. We have been building more market rate housing than affordable housing. So we're building basically for every one affordable home, we're building almost 4 market rate homes. And more recently, since the shuttering of the RDA, so there's less affordable funding. And now there's also some of these new bills have reduced the amount of affordable housing required to achieve certain density bonuses. And so you see, we've actually now at the point where we're 7-1. So we are digging ourselves into a bigger and bigger hole in terms of affordable housing. And it's a serious problem because, as we all know, the socioeconomic inequality that exists in the Bay Area and around the state is bad and worse than many other states in the country, but it is only going to get worse with this sort of direction. So we're really building luxury homes, and we are failing on the mandate to build affordable housing. But that cannot be blamed on the cities because they do not have the funding. All the income tax goes to the state. Cities get to keep 10% of their property tax. They don't have an income stream to be able to build the affordable housing. They were relying on the RDAs because that was a way for them to have access to more funding outside the property taxes that they have as revenue. But without that, builders have to be paid. Those affordable housing, there's only so much you can do to incentivize affordable housing. And the way it's that now, it comes at the expense of the more luxury housing for less affordable housing. So someone has to foot the bill. And I think the state has abdicated its responsibility as far as affordable housing goes. And they're trying to blame cities, but it's very clearly a failure on their part. Can we go to the next slide? And then I think it is really important to get these numbers right. I know that everybody will say, well, a lot of people say, you can't know for sure exactly what the housing need is. It's not a science. It's, economists estimate these numbers, and that is true. But there are standard, tried and true processes that are in place that are used in cities around the world and in agencies across the country, and endorsed by places like Harvard that have a joint center that studies housing, and that their approach is the approach that the HCD and Department of Finance have been using for the last 20 or 30 years. To show the difference in these approaches, I looked at, okay, what would these various models say for how much housing these 4 major regions in California had to build. So if you use what we're calling the conventional economist approach, but is actually, remember, the HCD standard tried and true method for the last 20 or 30 years. It's also the standard method that is proposed by other agencies across the country, including it's the approach that recommended by the Joint Center for Housing at Harvard University. That is 1.17 million by the end of the 6th cycle. The new HCD method, which has the double counts that were introduced by SB 828, has the number at 2.11 million. That McKinsey number, which we were talking about before, which had come up with the 3.5 million houses by 2030, their number just for the 4 regions would be 2.88 of that 3.5 million. Interestingly, if you use jobs to housing ratio as the metric, which is a number that a lot of these agencies talk about as being there's an optimal jobs to housing ratio, it makes sense. Like you have to have so many jobs to afford to justify so many houses. Their number is 1.5, and that I've seen published by the HCD and by ABAC, and that says that we only would need 230,000. That's it. That number seems definitely underbaked, but that is the number that suggests that the 1 to 1.5 or the 1 housing for every 1.5 job is not the right ratio, and perhaps that needs to be rethought. But actually speaking to that fact, some of these numbers, if we built, for example, the amount of housing that McKinsey suggests, or even the amount of housing that is dictated by the new HCD approach, we would have to add so many more jobs than are currently in the pipeline. Jobs tend to cycle over time, and obviously we're going to be into a bit of a trough. We're coming into a bit of a trough based on COVID, so there will be fewer jobs in the next few years. But it's cyclical, but it doesn't jump in the way that we would have to jump to justify the sort of housing that they're talking about. And I think that's some of these models don't then sort of play out what it really means in reality. What does that mean in terms of how many jobs you would have to have? What does it mean in terms of infrastructure needs for that many houses? And what does it mean in terms of transit? Anyway, there's much debate. Our next report is not just taking these three models. We're also going to, we've also looked at the Freddie Mac, which has done their own analysis of the housing needs across the United States. In fact, they say that there's 3.3 million houses needed for the entire US, which completely contradicts the McKinsey number. And so we're looking at their methodology and what it would mean for, what it really means for California. We're going to look at the two professors who critiqued my work, Professor Elmendorf and Monkanen from UCLA and one from UC Davis. And we're going to look at, we've looked at their model, we've built their model for these regions and we'll compare it to that. And Spur has a model as well. So we're going to compare all these models. I will say none of them are the Embarcadero Institute. We're not making this stuff up. These are models that have been developed either by departments, government agencies, or in this case, some university professors. But we'll show the reality of what it really means and what it means on the ground, what that would look like in terms of how many jobs you'd have to have, and how quickly you would have to build, and we'll see what makes sense. And I think that's the summary of our report today.
Is that your
Hi,
last slide, Gab?
Yes.
Okay.
Could I ask a
Thank you
question?
so much. Hang on a second, everybody. Most people are on mute, and Rick and Chris are going to handle taking the questions, I think. But I just wanted to thank Gab very much for making simple sense out of very, very complex information. And everyone should go to her site and just kind of go through all the slides. It's like a real wake-up call about what's gone on under SB 828. And it was a sleeper bill. Nobody paid much attention to it. And now it's causing this frankly, legal requirement of regions to build this much housing, and it will not happen. And when that doesn't happen, other laws kick in, most of them by Scott Wiener, that punish cities and take away their powers and put developers in charge of a lot of zoning and planning if the cities don't hit these targets. So we're not talking just about an interesting concept. We're talking about actual legal changes that completely change the power base in California. It's kind of like a horror movie. Okay.